G'day legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day and so far a fantastic midweek. Now I am still feeling very under the weather, but a few percent better than yesterday, and it will continue on that trajectory. I chose to follow my doctor, my oncologist's orders, and delay the drug and look for better options. Now, legends, of course, as always, we have a lot to go over. Now, I'm going to show you the month of March wrap-up kilometre squares and what this is actually telling us. And no, the title isn't clickbait, as some others around this may also be correct, but it's the way you then present the information. So I will show you this. And we need to go over different maps as well as some geolocations today also. But we need to go through the main meat of this video is going to be the New York Times article, The Secret History of the US and Ukraine and the inner workings, what took place there. And what I will say is many, many elements that we were called conspiracy theorists, propagandists, whatever you want to call me, in this has proven that what we reported at the time was correct, even if it was some speculation, but we were connecting the obvious dots. But also what we need to touch on, and something I'd been speaking about for a while, but I did fail to connect a dot, was the drone boats. And I had reported before that there may be domestic production, but there's a lot of international work and enablement going on behind the scenes here. And one thing which this has then come to the conclusion of, and the CIA's involvement there, is how this may have jeopardized one of the main elements that would be defending Taiwan from Chinese attack. I've been teasing for a while, but I have a large, massive video on China coming up in the near future. It was going to go up while I was sick, but maybe I'll do that in the next day or two. So, firstly, I want to talk about the maps. Of course, what you see in front of you is Ukraine. We'll break that down further because I want to talk about then the maps and the kilometre squares and the differing information that we have. Now, we had Deep State, they update every day, or most days, and they give them, we then draw out of that the monthly kilometre squares. But WarMapper, he also does it. But what I will say is WarMapper is very, very conservative when it comes to Russian gains. But what we see here is at the end of March 25, Russia occupies 18.3% of Ukraine. This represents a net gain by Russia of approximately 272.7 kilometre squares over the month. That is more than double what the deep state numbers were that we presented yesterday. But it goes a step much further than this. So this is the graph that I showed you yesterday. And again, like I said, how you interpret this information, this data is just as important as the data itself. Now, we saw yesterday I presented 133.5 kilometre squares by deep state, and today we have, on still a very conservative map for Russian gains, 272. So what this indicates is that this is growing from the month prior, okay? And also, it's double, but it's also 4-5 times then if we were to go back to March 24. And this is the thing. This tells us about momentum. This tells us about similar-ish weather conditions on the ground. Both are not perfect in war because war, unlike people want it to be, people want so much for this war to be linear and that this will take 5,000 years to reach Kyiv. War is not linear. But we need to extrapolate some more information coming out of this, because then on WarMapper's next slide, Russia retook control of the remaining 358 square kilometres of Kursk, while Ukraine has captured almost 12 square kilometres in Belgorod. This results in a total combined net Russian gain for the month of 618.8 kilometre squares, the third highest in the past year. So this tells us a lot, because what we're looking at is then, no, these gains have not slowed down. It's just changed that our graphs maybe don't show us. And again, this is why I say data presented. It's just as important how you present that as the data in itself. So we see titles like this. Russia's territorial gains in Ukraine dropped to the lowest level since June 2024. Now, this is correct within the Ukrainian borders. Yes, it is the slowest since June 2024 if we work off the deep state figure. It's not if we work off the war mapper because it's increased since then, but then the next we would be going back to then June, July in this sector here. Okay? Let's keep going. It actually should be July from my reading of that, but anyway. But if we go March 24 to March 25, as I've shown you year on year, we can look at just deep state numbers, and this gives you a 3.4 times increase on that. So you could also title it that way. Or if you then take the total including Kursk, you're looking at the second or third fastest since June, July 2022. So if we were to take the figure of, 619 for ease, and we take in 619, we are looking at the second fastest from what I'm seeing on a lot of these figures. So let's go 619 total. We're seeing the second fastest since back in 2022. So this can tell us a lot, and it tells us about some of the concerns on the front line. Now, of course, then if we were to do this, if it's net, then this August, September, October, especially August, September, these would likely be near zero, much lower or positive due to Kursk. But again, it does still tell us that the momentum here is sitting with Russia. This month on month, years back, as well as especially because of the assets that may have to be moved into Kursk. That is a lot of ground made. This idea that it has slowed down, maybe it's slowed within then the occupied areas, which War Mapper's numbers don't show, but overall, that is a large gain back. So we need to take the reality of the situation into account as well. We heard that Ukraine is occupying 12 kilometre squares in Belgorod. So let's talk about that. Here we have Ukraine, the centre of screen, the capital of Kyiv. The red areas occupied since 22, the purple since 2014. Now, we'll come into, we see a Belgorod Oblast here. This is Kursk Oblast, and it's just on this area around Demidovkia, as well as Popovkia in here. This is saying 13, but let's say it's close enough to 12 or 13. This is still showing grey zone, not occupied, but I've shown you geolocations in both Popovkia and Demidovkia. What I haven't seen, if any, like actual troop-to-troop fighting in here or armoured-to-armoured fighting. I've seen Ukrainian elements and Russian artillery, drones, and fabs. Now, this could just be that I haven't seen this yet, but that is how I have seen it so far in these areas that were supposedly then abandoned. But there has been a strike here, and this is the geolocation. So we see to the north of Popovkia, this dam in here has been hit by claimed a Fab 3000. So let's watch this footage. See the dam, and then we see Fab bomb here. Now again, I don't know if Fab 1500 or 3000. Personally, I actually believe this is most likely a Fab 1500. The 3000 has, unless it's been upgraded, which it may have been, has less accuracy, and realistically, the bang for buck, you have the law of diminishing returns when it comes to these. So I think with what I'm seeing, it's probably likely a 1500. Personally, that's what I think. When we see the size of this explosion, massive, but not compared to, say, even the 3Ks that we see landing in Vovchansk, again, doesn't matter. But that this dam has been exploded here. So what may this tell us? We need to jump onto the topographical map. And this isn't awfully clear either because we don't have the exact data on this. So I've just drawn this line in, Demidovkia, Popovkia, super rough of where Ukraine occupy roundabouts. Now we can see the dam here, but of course this is going to be lower areas to the north of here. And where may this flow to cut off further Ukrainian advancements? And this is what the Russian pages are saying, is that this is going to stop Ukraine being able to move further elements onto the border of then Kursk and Belgorod, as well as armoured movements to the extreme north of Popovkia and Demidovkia. So you can see where the low ground is sitting in here and how it gets lower along the border back into then, this crosses to Kursk and then actually into Sumy. So again, wait and see on what is going to be the outcome of that. So let's have a look at some other areas on the maps. Now, no changes up in this area for what I have seen. Now, we have near Dovrichnia to then the south of here towards then Kupiansk. We have a Russian advancement shown in the red check on this map, and again shown on this Syriac map, of course, much, much further though. You can see where this road comes here, that it's saying it's along this. The Russian army intensified operations west of Kalinove and slowed approach towards this area. During the last hours, the Russian forces managed to reach into the first houses of then the village in here. So saying that there was definite advancement in here. Now, let's move our way down on today's map, and we'll go over then yesterday's map. So we see that the Portal boys, the Portal Island boys, are out in here. Now, what have I said? I think that this doesn't line up with the tactics of attritional grinding warfare that we have seen Russia have, that most likely it looks like this. Even if some thumbnails are suggesting that there's going to be a large cutoff in here, just as was suggested about several different areas along the front line, and it's proven to just be a grind forward on this front. Let's look at what Syriac is saying in here, one of the most reliable then mappers, and this shows a lot different. So this is showing that Rozliv, has come under basically where we drew, okay? But then to the north of here, to the south of Constantinople, that the Russians have had a westerly push all the way to where this road then meets. Now, if this was correct, from here, it's a 3.3 kilometre advancement. But wait out on that one, not even the grey zone is suggesting that for now. So let's actually then step, because they're the only two changes, apologies. We see then another change near then the Sukabalka front to the south in here. Remember, Syriac is showing a lot of this down through Alexandropil has come under control too. Okay, apologies. They are the only three updates we saw on then the map today. Okay, I don't know what is happening, but the date up here won't change. But I believe now we're on today's map, okay? I think what we actually just showed you was yesterday, but still relevant. And then on today's map, we can see to the south of Srebini, more movement around the direction of Andriivka. This is as well where Syriac has been showing changes. But as well, keep an eye out for other areas on the front line. But where we do need to look at is then this Terni area. Now, I don't think we have seen any changes on this map. I can't trust the date. To be honest, I can't really trust the map, but let's have a look in here. During the last 4 days, Russia took control over fortifications northwest and west of Nova Lyubovkia. So this is the area we are looking. So let's zoom in, and we have Nova Lyubovkia as this red dot in here, and then we have Nevsky, that in between here towards Katanivkia, that this is filling in. That the Russians aren't just out on one big spire here, that it is then pushing and expanding, pushing and expanding. Again, as per we have seen the Russian tactics over the past then years. So let's talk about this secret history article that has come out from the New York Times. And there's some very interesting bits in here and some bits of which we have reported, but this all went over as conspiracy, speculation, propaganda, but it's all now gone from that to now accepted. And this is titled The Secret History of the War in Ukraine. Time and time again, the Biden administration authorised clandestine operations it had previously prohibited. American military advisors were dispatched to Kyiv and later allowed to travel closer to the fighting. Military and CIA officers in Poland helped plan and support a campaign of Ukrainian strikes in Russian-annexed Crimea. Finally, military and then the CIA received green light to enable pinpoint strikes deep inside Russia itself. And this is as we reported, and what we said was we see a significant increase in a significant amount of strikes, pinpoint strikes, on senior Russian officers being taken out. What we said was there's definitely a relaying of intelligence for those strikes to be carried out, as this goes over in this article. Again, we're not going to go over the full article. You can go read it yourself. We're going over the bits that I find then very important for what the conditions and the battlefield that we see at the moment. In some ways, Ukraine was, on a wider canvas, a rematch in a long history of US-Russia proxy wars, from Vietnam to Afghanistan and Syria. Now, one thing I'll say about this is I agree, but If we compare what these proxy wars then goal was it to improve the life for the civilians in these countries? Was that improved following these wars at all? Or was the goal of the war to weaken their major opponent? Was intervention by the Soviets in Vietnam, the Russians and the Mujahideen in Afghanistan when the Soviets went in, and Syria, was that with this, we're doing intervention to make things better for the civilians, or was it we're doing it to weaken the opposing side? Okay. It was also a grand experiment in war fighting, one that would not only help Ukrainians but reward the Americans with lessons for any future war. And it was relatively cheap to weaken their largest military competition and to get then the strategies moving forward and experience in conventional war without any of your own blood. And again, relatively cheap. The way the system worked is Task Force Drag, and this was set up to help Ukraine, would tell the Ukrainians where the Russians were positioned, but to protect intelligence sources and methods from Russian spies, it would not say how it knew what it knew. All the Ukrainians would see on a secure cloud were chains of coordinates divided into baskets of their priority level. As a Ukrainian general remembers, when the Ukrainians asked why should they trust the intelligence, an American general said, "Don't worry about how we found out, just trust that when you shoot, it will hit and you'll get results." Again, we're heard again and again from then the administrations that no, we're not at war with Russia. Now, we see this about then in Kherson, Kharkiv, late 22, and the jeopardization that this may have occurred with then problems into Bakhmut and then further on to 2023. As we say, war is like an organism. It's holistic. You push somewhere, you're going to have effect down the line. You eat Maccas today, you're not going to be fat, but in 12 months later, you may be, and you choose this and it changes down the track. Now, it was said by then generals, if you guys want to get across the river and get into the neck of Crimea, then follow the plan being laid out by the US. But as we see here that multiple times, Zelensky has stepped on military commanders and military decisions to provide optics for political reasons and propaganda. Remember that military operations need to be supported by propaganda. Propaganda can't be then the military operation. Kursk was a great example of this. That was the plan until it wasn't. Zelensky sometimes spoke directly with regional commanders, and after one such conversations, the Americans were informed that the order of battle had changed. The American general told a Ukrainian general, of course, who you'll be familiar with, of General Zhuluzny, who was fired by Zelensky, that more time was needed to lay the groundwork for Kherson. The switch, he said, to put the counteroffensive and the entire country in jeopardy. The Americans later learned the backstory, so that this would jeopardize it all. If you actually want to cross and keep going, you can't do what is at least being told. Zelensky was hoping to attend the mid-September meeting of the UN, the General Assembly, with showing signs of progress on the battlefield. He and his advisors believed that would bolster his case for additional military support. So they upended the plan at the last minute, a preview of a fundamental disconnect that would increasingly shape the arc of war. The upshot wasn't what anyone had planned. The Ukrainians were already exerting pressure on the ground, and the Biden administration had authorised helping the Ukrainians develop, manufacture, and deploy an ascent fleet of maritime drones to attack the Russian Black Sea Fleet. The Americans gave the Ukrainians an early prototype meant to counter a Chinese naval assault on Taiwan. Now, this is what we have been told, is that all of this was domestic. And as I've told you, not all of this was domestic. There's a lot of enablement going on behind the scenes. No one believed me. Now, many have raised concerns, both publicly but mostly behind closed doors, that now the Russians have had time to develop strategies against these drone boats, against these Beks. We should assume that that has been handed to the Chinese. The Chinese will want that and they may pay for that. So could have we in this somehow jeopardise one of the main things that would stop then Chinese navy and merchant fleets from reaching Taiwan and delivering a shitload of men? But let's continue on this, and we'll go back to the planning of these operations. The planning for 23 began straight away at what in hindsight was a moment of irrational exuberance. Ukraine controlled the west banks of the Oskil and Dnipro rivers. Within the coalition, the prevailing wisdom was that the 23 counteroffensive would be the war's last, with Zelensky telling the coalition that we're going to win the whole thing. To accomplish this, a Ukrainian general explained as the partners gathered in Poland again that General Zaluzhny was once again insisting that the primary effort be an offensive towards Melitopol to strangle Russian forces in Crimea. So let me show you a couple of areas. So we have Otokiv. This is where we're looking at offensives. Melitopol down here. Mariupol across here. You'll need to know Tokmak as well. And as well, of course, you'll need to know Bakhmut. Right? And once again, some American generals were preaching caution. At the Pentagon, officials worried about their ability to supply enough weapons for the counteroffensive. Perhaps the Ukrainians, in their strongest possible position, should consider cutting a deal. When the Joint Chief Chairman, General Miley, floated that idea in a speech, many Ukrainian supporters, including congressional Republicans, then overwhelmingly supportive of the war, cried appeasement. Now, so far he has been correct, as Professor John Mearsheimer will say, and many others, that this was the high water line. And so far he has been correct. That was the point at which Ukraine had the most amount of ground back and some amount of momentum. Should this have been the point where we go, yep, how's 23 actually going to look versus what we have seen then happen? And so far he has proven to be correct. Now, again, in this area, at this command centre, in private conversations with the Ukrainian general and the British, the American general pointed to those Russian trenches being dug to defend the south. He pointed to the Ukrainians halting advance to the Dnipro just weeks before, saying they're digging in, guys. How are you going to get across this? What he advocated instead to Ukrainian generals and European officials, as an official recalled, that it was a pause. If the Ukrainians spent the next year, if not longer, building, training new brigades, they would be far better positioned to fight through to Melitopol. This is basic doctrine for this style of war. Ukraine was not in a position to launch the 23 offensive. Russia put themselves in a position to launch the 24 offensive. Okay, so after the then initiation of hostilities, you then will see little positional shifting. As you regroup, you remobilize. Typically, this takes 2 years. You dig in your fortifications and you have time to mobilise and train a new army. It can only commence after you've met these. Newly mobilised forces, the enemy strategic reserve is exhausted, you have superiority of artillery fires and reconnaissance, and their industrial sector is degraded. Only after meeting these can offensive operations commence. This was not met. Although it was launched anyway, a lot because Zelensky needed to show successes on the battlefield. The British, for their part, argued that if the Ukrainians were going to go anyway, the coalition needed to help them. They didn't have to be as good as the British or Americans, they just had to be better than the Russians. There would be no pause. And that the Ukrainian generals would say that the US was right, but he would also admit that nobody liked his recommendations except for me. And besides, this guy, he was on his way out to be then replaced. So it went ahead as we then saw, and it failed. The counteroffensive, it was meant to begin on May the 1st, but the intervening months would be spent on training for it. Sursky would contribute 4 battle-hardened brigades, each with 3,000 to 5,000 soldiers for training in Europe. They would be joined by 4 brigades of new recruits. But the General Sursky, who you'll see brought up a lot in this, and is to blame for things like Kursk and Bakhmut and other areas, he had other plans. In Bakhmut, the Russians were deploying and losing vast numbers of soldiers. Everyone was in there. Sursky saw an opportunity to engulf them and ignite discord in their ranks, saying take all new guys for Melitopol, according to US officials. So don't take the battle-hardened veterans with experience, take all new guys for the offensive. And Mr. Zelensky sided with Sursky over the objection of both his own supreme commander, General Zaluzhny, and the Americans. A key underpinning of the counteroffensive was effectively scuttled. Now the Ukrainians would send just 4 untested brigades abroad for training. 8 more would be prepared inside of Ukraine. A senior US official recalled, "All we kept thinking was that this is not great because what they were receiving was guys in their 40s and 50s. Now, if you don't think this is correct, look at the interview I've had with Mr. Tatarigami Ue, speaking about these ratios were bullshit in Bakhmut and that the roads were completely under fire control and no one could come out. But even if you're trading casualties at 1 to 3 or 1 to 4 ratio when the enemy has 3 to 4 times the population and is sending yesterday's prisoners against patriotic, motivated professional soldiers, that's not really a win, whilst your new guys were sent away for training for the heralded massive end-of-war counter-offensive." Sursky was the commander of this, as well as Kursk and other sectors, eventually outing Zhuluzny and replacing him as well. That decision was buried under the successes of Ukraine's 22 campaigns in Kharkiv and Kherson, along with the excitement leading up to summer 23, and that this was one last push and it's all done. In late May, intelligence showed the Russians were rapidly building new brigades. The Ukrainians didn't have everything they wanted, but they had what they thought they needed. They would have to go. Again, this is very simple doctrine around attritional warfare. Of this, it was not one of these was ticked off. Russia, at the same time, did not have one of these ticked off. That's why they had basically a 2-year break. Now, Zhuluzny outlined the final plan at a meeting in Stavka, a government body overseeing military matters. This other general would have 12 brigades and the bulk of ammunition for the main assault on Melitopol, where I showed you. Then General Sursky spoke. According to Ukrainian officials, the general said he wanted a break from the plan and to execute a full-scale attack to drive the Russians from Bakhmut. He would then advance eastwards to a Lugansk region. He would, of course, need additional men and ammunition. The Americans were not told about the meeting's outcome, but then US intelligence observed Ukrainian troops and ammunitions moving in directions inconsistent with the agreed-upon plan, that Melitopol plan in the south. Soon after, hastily arranged meeting on the Polish border, Zhuluzny admitted to Generals Kavoli and Agutu that the Ukrainians had in fact decided to mount assaults in 3 directions at once. Americans cried out that this is not the plan. What had happened, according to the Ukrainian officials, was this. After the meeting, Zelensky had ordered that the coalition's ammunition be split evenly between Sursky and the other general for the south, and that Sursky would also get 5 of the newly trained brigades, leaving 7 for the Melitopol fight. The Ukrainian official remarked it was like watching the demise of the Melitopol offensive even before it was launched. An American senior official said we should have walked away. These decisions involving life and death and what territory you value more and what territory you value less are fundamentally sovereign Ukrainian decisions. All we could do was give them advice. So you can see this undermining of these things. And this is exactly what I spoke about of Kursk as well, including the exact same names of what you are now seeing. The leader of the Mariupol assault, General Sodol, was an eager consumer of General Agutu's advice. The collaboration produced one of the counteroffensive's biggest successes after American intelligence identified a weak point in the Russian lines. His forces then captured Starmorsky and another 8 square miles of territory. Again, this has now been turned back, but where we're talking about is Velika Novosilka front and then Starmorsky. This attack, of course, trying to reach then Mariupol as another one to Melitopol. This was the plan, but Sursky wanted to launch into Bakhmut. For the Ukrainians, the victory posed a question. Might the Mariupol fight be more promising than the one towards Melitopol? But the attack stalled for lack of manpower. The problem was laid out right there on the battlefield map in his office. That General Sursky's assault on Bakhmut was starving the Ukrainian army. General Agutu urged him to send brigades and ammunition south for the Melitopol attack. Sursky wouldn't budge, according to officials. Nor would he budge when Prigozhin, whose Wagner paramilitaries had helped the Russians capture Bakhmut, rebelled against Putin's military leadership and sent forces racing towards Moscow. US intel assessed the rebellion could erode Russian morale and cohesion. intercepts detected Russian commanders surprised that the Ukrainians weren't pushing harder towards a tenaciously defended Melitopol. So again, having to move forces, even the Russians going, why aren't they pushing here? But as Sersky saw it, the rebellion validated his strategy of sowing division by impaling the Russians in Bakhmut. To send some of his forces south would only undercut it. So again, ego decision. I was right. You were wrong. That's what Sersky had said to this other commander. We're going to get Luhansk. We've seen how that went. Zelensky had framed Bakhmut as the fortress of our morale. In the end, it was a blood-drenched demonstration of outmanned Ukrainians' predicament and a huge backfire on many, many areas. But the first immediate business here was General Kolovy and Agutu explained that they saw no plausible path to reclaiming significant territory in 2024. The coalition simply couldn't provide all the equipment for a major counteroffensive, nor could the Ukrainians build up an army big enough to mount one. The Ukrainians, they would have to temper their expectations, focusing on more achievable objectives to stay in the fight while building the combat power to potentially mount offensives in 25. But again, these failed offensives that shouldn't have been launched earlier than that, they jeopardised this. They would need to erect defensive lines, which we didn't see en masse in the east to prevent the Russians seizing more territories, as we saw through 24 and in the beginning of 25. They would need to reconstitute existing brigades and fill new ones. We saw a lot of new brigades with then not refilling new ones as well, that the coalition would train and equip. Zelensky voiced his support. Yet the Americans knew he did grudgingly. Time and time again, Zelensky made it clear that he wanted and needed a big win to bolster morale at home and shore up Western support, optics driving command. Just weeks before, the president had instructed Zaluzny to push the Russians back to Ukraine's 1991 borders by fall of 24. Again, it's easy to say, Zaluzny, push these guys back. Okay? Zaluzny, he shocked the Americans by presenting a plan that would need 5 million shells and 1 million drones. He said, well, from where? And again, we know Zaluzny, he also said to Zelensky that he needs 500,000 more men. Again, Zaluzny, love him or hate him, he was correct on a lot of these things, including when he said that the war was at a stalemate. When he returned, gone pale as a ghost, he led General Agutu to a balcony and pulling on a Lucky Strikes, a cigarette, told him the Ukrainian leadership struggle had reached its denouement. General Zaluzny, he was being fired to be replaced by Sersky. I'd love to know the actual because Sersky, of course, was in the Russian military, in Russian command, and now is very close with Zelensky, and we've seen a stream of massively failed actions. The Americans were hardly surprised. They'd been hearing ample murmurings of a presidential discontent. The Ukrainians would chalk it up to politics, to fear that the widely popular General Zaluzny might challenge Zelensky for presidency. There was also this stub meeting where the president effectively kneecapped Zaluzny, and the general's subsequent decision to publish a piece in The Economist declaring the war was at a stalemate. Zaluzny, one American official said, he was a dead man walking. Honestly, I think it's surprising we didn't see Zaluzny killed with some of the things he had come out with, and we know he's toned that back a lot. Summer 24, Ukraine's armies in the north and east were stretched dangerously thin. Still, General Sersky kept telling the Americans that I need a win. Foreshadowing came back to March, when the Americans discovered that Ukraine's military intelligence, the GUR, was furtively planning a ground operation into the southwest of Russia. The CIA station chief in Kiev confronted the GUR commander, Budanov. If he crossed into Russia, he would do so without American weapons or intelligence support. The Biden administration officials, they would joke at moments like this, that they knew more about what the Russians were planning to spy on them than what the Ukrainian partners were planning. Of course, this was the crossing into Kursk that Ukraine, they asked for forgiveness, not permission, and the Biden administration, they bent the knee and sent in that support because otherwise it would have been an absolute chaos with even larger losses. Again, further down in a paragraph, Kursk, the Americans concluded, was the win Zelensky had been hinting at all along. It was evidence of his calculations. He spoke of total victory. But one of the operation's goals, he explained to the Americans, was leverage to capture and hold Russian land that could be traded for Ukrainian land in future negotiations. Again, we've seen what has become of that. And as Mr. Tatarigami says, all propaganda is a double-edged sword. It comes back to bite you. Austin then pressed Zelensky to take a bigger, bolder step and begin drafting 18-year-olds, to which Zelensky shot back. Why would I draft more people? We don't have the equipment to give them. And your general, Austin then replied, well, your generals are reporting that your units are undermanned. They don't have enough soldiers for the equipment they have. In Ukraine's view, the Americans weren't willing to do what was necessary to help them prevail. In the Americans' view, the Ukrainians weren't willing to do what was necessary to help themselves prevail. So what we do see is there is a manpower shortage, but the Ukraine would not then mobilise the manpower needed, saying there wasn't enough weapons. But we heard the US at the time saying, you send us the men, we'll send you the weapons. And we also had Ukrainian commanders say, we have stuff, we just have no one else to be on them. Zelensky said often, in response to the draft question, that his country was fighting for its future, that 18 to 25-year-olds were the fathers of that future. To one American official, though, it's not an existential war if they won't make their people fight. This is the manpower paradox, Zelensky, is you're saying that this is existential, that Ukraine won't have a future unless you win the war. There's no way to win the war or even have better outcomes if then you won't mobilise these guys. But you say if we mobilise these guys, that then it's risking the future of the country. See where this paradox is sitting. Maybe that high waterline was a few 100,000 guys ago, back at the end of 22. Legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day, and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.